Welcome, and thank you for watching KIPEC's interview series. I'm Olivia Kim, Research Fellow here at KIPEC. Today, we'll be examining what developments in the Taiwan Strait mean for South Korea's security environment and ROK-US alliance. To help us unpack these issues, I am very pleased to welcome John Dotson, Director at the Global Taiwan Institute. John brings deep experience in U.S. national security and East Asia policy. He previously served as a U.S. Navy officer and worked on the staff of the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. He was also an editor of China Brief at the Jamestown Foundation. He has written extensively on CCP political warfare, PLA modernization, and Taiwan security issues. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Olivia, for the very kind invitation. It's a pleasure.
Sure. So to begin, I'd like to step back and look at the broader policy landscape before moving into South Korea-specific questions.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. In the Washington policy community, discussions about the Taiwan Strait feel especially prominent right now. From your perspective, has attention actually increased, or has this been a steady focus for some time? Or what's driving this level of interest?
I would say there has been a change, not anything that happened abruptly or suddenly, and I would also argue like not really anything that you could identify with a particular moment in time, a particular event, anything like that. I think it's been more gradual and steady over the past several years, and I mean, there's a number of reasons for that. There's never any one simple explanation for it, but I would argue that I think if you look at over time, if you look at U.S. Relations with both the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and with Taiwan, that it's often been the case that there's kind of an inverse relationship. Sort of when at times when U.S. relations with the PRC are a little friendlier, or when it's sort of the policy of the U.S. government to focus very much on engagement with the PRC, then sort of Taiwan is kind of like pushed more into the corner. I think that was very much the case I think if you go back in time, perhaps to the Clinton administration, and then following that, the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, I think the mainstream political thinking in both of America's two major political parties was very much on engagement with the PRC, and there was the mainstream thinking was that was of an optimistic view of the future of U.S. China relations. I myself was always more skeptical of that. But I and a few others were in the minority on that. My own view is that the nature of the Chinese state, the Chinese Communist Party, is going to lead it in a particular direction that will be very much contrary to, I think, the expectations that a lot of people in the engagement school rather have had. But anyway, and so I think during that period of time and during those presidential administrations, it was unfortunately the case that I think Taiwan may have been I think was frequently looked at sort of almost as like a problem or an irritant in U.S.-China relations. If only we could get past this Taiwan problem, then maybe we could have a more productive relationship with Beijing. Once again, I had a different view, but I think that view was very widespread. I would say the conventional wisdom or the mainstream thinking has really shifted in the last over the course of the last several years, and that's largely because of the deterioration of the relationship between Washington and Beijing. I think both on the economic side and on the security side. I think in past years the U.S. business community had a much more optimistic view of the possibility of liberalized trade and of a better economic relationship with China. They saw the value of cheaper production in China if they move manufacturing production to China. I think they had high hopes for the Chinese market, but for a range of reasons, which we could discuss separately, that would almost be another conversation. I think all of those hopes were dashed. But then also at the same time, we've seen over the last few years increasingly aggressive
Mhm.
and irredentist
Mhm.
behavior on the part of the Chinese state,
Yeah.
um, with the increasing coercive efforts being directed against Taiwan. And once again, we could perhaps discuss that a little bit further. But not just against Taiwan, against other states in the region as well. The Philippines is certainly on the receiving end of a very aggressive Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, around Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, so forth, and even going beyond the region to sort of what's often been termed the wolf warrior diplomacy
Mhm.
that the PRC has directed against other countries. This very strident nationalist sort of diplomacy that often really seems intended more to score points back at home than it does to really productively engage uh,
Mhm.
with other countries. And so, for all these reasons, and but primarily because of the deterioration of the U.S. PRC relationship, I think it's opened up more space for Taiwan. And
Mhm.
along with that, I think has come to be a slowly kind of an increasing maybe appreciation in policy circles in the United States of sort of Taiwan's role as a democracy. Taiwan having gone through a really impressive democratic transition after decades of dictatorship. Something that it of course shares
Yeah.
with the Republic of Korea.
Mhm.
And I think there's an increasing appreciation for that as well. So there are multiple reasons, but I do think if you had to narrow it down to just one,
Mhm.
it would be sort of the increasing rivalry between
Mhm.
the United States and the PRC, and the increased space that has accordingly opened up for
Mhm.
Taiwan.
I think that your response had a lot to unpack right there because you did
Mhm.
mention other states and other regional, interest and economic and like strategic, like all different like dimensions that we have to unpack. So I am gonna dive into kind of Korea's strategic equities in Taiwan Strait. So what are
Mhm.
South Korea's strategic equities in the Taiwan Strait? How should South Korean lawmakers understand the current military and political dynamics in the Taiwan Strait? And which developments would have the most direct implications for South Korea's security?
Sure. Well, on one level, I would think South Korea would have the same geopolitical equities of any state
Mhm.
uh, in the Asia Pacific region. Both of wishing to see continued economic development,
Yeah.
wishing to prevent either a war
Mhm.
or some other sort of limited military conflict or crisis that could threaten Korea's security. They could damage Korea's economy and so forth. So again, I think the same equities that any state in Asia might have, but in the case of South Korea, I mean, perhaps arguably even more so. For a few reasons. South Korea is in the unusual circumstance of being a state where it has that there are two larger, powerful rival states around it, one of whom, China, is a very important trading partner, like a really central economic and trading partner for Korea, and then with the United States having very long-standing security relationship with South Korea. In fact, having an actual treaty obligating the United States to the defense of the ROK. So it's in one sense it's kind of unusual for a state to find itself in that position, but because of these equities, sort of having to seek a accommodation or a friendly relationship with both sides at a time when the relations between those two other states seem to be in a kind of a trajectory of slowly but steadily deteriorating or becoming more hostile.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and I think perhaps for Korea, for South Korea, there's another additional element in that South Korea is effectively an island in many ways. Of
Yeah, you're
course,
right.
it's on a peninsula. It's on the southern end of a peninsula, and the northern end of that peninsula is occupied by a rival hostile state. But that sort of it effectively makes the ROK an island.
Mhm.
And in that sense, it means that uh, maritime trade, maritime sea lanes, so forth, are all the more important. And with the ROK being having sort of very much an export oriented economy,
Mhm.
once again, it means that maintaining open sea lanes, free international trade, and so forth is particularly important to it. So for all those reasons, I would say that it's what happens in regards to Taiwan or to peace and security in the Pacific is perhaps even more important for South Korea than it is for some other countries. And in terms of the dynamics in the Taiwan Strait itself, uh, they're I would say they're slowly but steadily becoming more tense than they were. For many, of course, it's always been the position of the Chinese government, the PRC government. They've always maintained the position that Taiwan was a province of China, even though the PRC as a state has never controlled or administered Taiwan in any way. But they've always maintained that claim. It's our province, and we're going to get it back someday. Now, for many decades, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, was largely satisfied to sort of let that problem bide its time, while they were
Mhm.
more focused on largely on the domestic issues, either domestic political turmoil or then on economic development and so forth. But that's really changed dramatically in the
Mhm.
last few years. um, People often point to 2022 as being a watershed year when with the visit of then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. But I would actually argue that going back a little further, like there are some developments that you could look at in the 20 teens that signaled a much more intense sort of PRC focus on pursuing unification with Taiwan. And I would argue, really, when you talk about unification in this sense, you're really talking about annexation, because it's the intent
Mhm.
of the PRC to sort of not just to bring Taiwan back under the Chinese flag, but also to exercise full Communist Party political control over Taiwan.
Mhm.
And there are some things you can point to in the 20 teens, like 2017, and then into 2019, for example, Xi Jinping issued a sort of a policy speech on Taiwan that signaled a more intense focus on unification, again, as the PRC government defines it. And
Mhm.
along with that, it's sent from 2019 forward on the present day, we've seen a pretty steady escalation in terms of both the coercive military pressure that the PRC has directed against Taiwan, the military exercises and so forth, things that often get a lot of media attention, but also things that don't get so much media attention. Intensification of propaganda, efforts to subvert Taiwan's democratic system, and espionage, things like this. So I think we're seeing the dynamics in the Strait are changing, really
Mhm.
primarily because of increased pressure coming from the PRC side.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So, in a potential Taiwan Strait conflict, let's say, what would the U.S. military defeat mean for South Korea? And in that scenario, what kinds of support might the U.S. expect from South Korea?
Mhm. Sure. Well, obviously, if there were, God forbid, to be
Yeah,
an
should be
actual
fun. Yeah.
shooting war over Taiwan, it could be one that could be very destructive
Mhm.
uh, to both sides. Now, in the event of an actual defeat, if U.S. military forces intervened, uh,
Mhm.
were defeated by Chinese forces, which and then following from that, if there were some like PRC takeover of Taiwan, or at least a partial takeover, or some sort of continuing conflict, it would have really disastrous consequences for the United States,
Mhm.
both for the prestige of the United States, the um, the reliability that people would ascribe to U.S. security commitments,
Mhm.
as well as to the the reduction of U.S. military power that would come from presumed naval losses and so forth. So I mean, it would have really disastrous consequences for the geopolitical standing
Mhm.
of the United States, which is why I personally would argue all the more that there really needs to be a really sustained
Mhm.
U.S. military geopolitical focus on the Asia Pacific region.
Mhm.
And personally, I would advocate for more attention on the Pacific and not a withdrawal, as
Mhm.
some people in U.S. policy circles might now be advocating. But once again, that might be almost a separate discussion. For South Korea, I mean, I think this theoretical set of circumstances in which there was a conflict over Taiwan and a decisive U.S. defeat, I really think it would force South Korea to fundamentally rethink its
Mhm.
security relationship with the United States and its own geopolitical position. Again, for decades, the ROK has really sort of depended upon U.S. security support. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't taking very serious actions on its own, in terms of military resources and so forth to counter the threat from North Korea. It has certainly done that, but it has relied upon the United States as a security partner. And I think in the theoretical event of the U.S. defeat, I think South Korean policymakers and the public would be forced to really rethink that. Uh,
Mhm.
and well, do we have to turn someplace else to for an ally, or do we have to now seek greater geopolitical accommodation with the PRC, sort of bandwagon with it? So I think there would be some really fundamental questions that South Korea would have to face in the event of any such outcome. Um, but now, if there were to be a conflict over Taiwan, it's getting to your question as to what I think the United States might ask
Yeah.
or expect in terms of support. I would say
Right.
my answer probably won't be much of a surprise.
Mhm.
I expect that. I mean, I would expect in any such circumstance that sort of the diplomatic position that the South Korean government might stake out would be one in which calling for the
Mhm.
warring parties to desist for a ceasefire, and would probably want to involve any active overt engagement, or certainly would want to avoid the active engagement of ROK forces in
Mhm.
military action. Now, what the position of I expect the U.S. government would probably be looking to its major allies in the region, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines,
Right.
would be looking to them for diplomatic support, but I also think logistical support and military support. Of course, it would depend on what I don't know administration might be in office in the time. I don't expect though that it's hard for me to see a U.S. presidential administration sort of demanding the active involvement of ROK forces in fighting.
Okay.
But I would expect there would be demands made behind the scenes for logistical support, full access to bases, all this sort of thing. And actually, I would expect, and again, you never really can say, it depends on the administration in office at the time, that I would expect it would probably be the position of U.S. policymakers in such a conflict to also have a continuing concern about actions that might be taken by the North Korean regime, and
Right.
might say would probably say to their South Korean counterparts, like stay focused on that. That's
Right.
you know
Mhm.
keep monitoring that situation and make sure that nothing blows up there. That you have adequate attention and resources focused on that, and prevent that from blowing up, so that that we're not having two wars at the same time. That would be my educated guess,
Mhm.
but of course, a lot of it might depend upon the particular people in office at the time.
So when you mention Korean military, like, do you include United States Forces Korea as well, or you
Mhm.
just really Korean, military?
No, well, certainly, yeah. No, I would expect again that again in such a theoretical conflict,
Mhm.
uh, U.S. forces in Korea, USFK, U.S. forces
Yes.
Korea,
Okay. Yes.
and the U.S. Forces deployed to Korea, I think would be probably largely in a support role.
Mhm.
Um, again, logistical support.
Yeah.
You have to have movement of logistics. Personnel working airfields,
Yeah.
all sort of thing. And I expect USFK would probably would be pretty well occupied with that, and again also with continuing to keep a watch on North Korea for provocations. And
Mhm.
so my educated guess would be that would probably be the
Yeah.
focus of USFK in any sort of crisis situation like we're discussing here.
Yeah, I think that's really clear. And I mean, you mentioned like educated guesses, but I think that some folks here in DC agree with your
Mm.
speculation. So next question. So we're seeing Congress move toward more strategic clarity on Taiwan, while the Trump administration still leans towards strategic ambiguity. From South Korea's perspective, how should we understand this difference in signaling coming out of Washington?
Sure. Well, I think once again, if you look at the last few decades of history, including what I was saying before, going back 20 years, 25 years, when there was this much more optimistic view in Washington of relations with the PRC. There's always been a bit of a cleavage or a difference, often between presidential administrations and Congress.
Mm,
Presidential administrations have tended in the past, not necessarily seeking to right now, but again in past years, tend to be more optimistic or forward leaning in terms of trying to engage with the PRC. I think that was the case in the again Clinton administration, George W. Bush, Obama administrations, um, and accordingly, kind of kept Taiwan to the side, and you could see that in things like delayed arms sales, things like this. But throughout all those years, Congress has traditionally been more of a center of support for
mhm,
Taiwan. I mean, you could really even take that all the way back to the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, which to some degree, Congress kind of shoved down the throat of the Carter administration,
mhm,
which perhaps might not have been really excited to see legislation that might tie its hands on how it would deal with Taiwan and China. Even going back to that in 1979, that was a statement by Congress that like, hey, even though we're switching diplomatic relations, you better not sell Taiwan down the river, and we're gonna put this legislation in place to send a message about that. Um, and that's continued in the years since. Now, to some degree, it has been true throughout those years, these recent decades. I think in regards to Taiwan as a specific issue, there was probably greater attention to it in the Republican Party, with the Democratic Party largely being a little bit more oriented towards, again, sort of seeking a positive relationship with the PRC and hopefully progress on things like climate change and so forth. Uh, but there are always sort of security hawks within the Republican Party, who may have had a more skepticism towards China and seen it as an emerging threat, and also would have had more of an ideological or sense of ideological opposition to communism. So that support for Taiwan you would have found a little more strongly probably in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. I would argue, though, that another change we've seen in the last few years that's not really so true. Um,
mhm,
and I think that support, well, both skepticism about China, about the PRC, but along with that, support for Taiwan is more bipartisan now. And I can point to some examples of prominent Democratic members of Congress who are a little more forward-leaning and speaking out in support of Taiwan. Representative Krishnamurti just would be one example. So I think it has become more of a bipartisan issue, which is obviously very positive for Taiwan in having I think in terms of policymakers in Taipei wanting to ensure a base of support in Washington. It's always better if it's more broadly based and bipartisan rather than being based more in just one party. But I would argue that is kind of a significant change that's taken place in the last few years. That within Congress, Taiwan is not as much of a niche issue as it would have been, but one with a little bit more broad-based support to it.
I think that was a good, excellent explanation, since you're going back to 1970s and you clearly understand the landscape, within the Congress. So I want to talk about the recent fact sheets between Trump and the administrations. So it
Mm-hmm.
explicitly reaffirmed the importance of maintaining peace and stability in Taiwan Strait and opposing unilateral changes to the status quo. How should Korean lawmakers interpret this language in terms of U.S. expectations for South Korea's role in a potential Taiwan Strait crisis?
Sure. I guess my take on that is that, well, first, the language in the fact sheet
Yeah.
is fairly restrained and
Mhm.
general. As you say, calling for maintaining peace and stability in the region, opposing unilateral changes to the status quo. Well, for the most part, that's kind of boilerplate language, like who would get upset or angry about that, right? But I think it's kind of interesting on 2 points. One is that in this instance, the South Korean government was willing to sign on to a statement sort of opposing unilateral changes to the status quo. And that could be taken as a very gentle, indirect pushback to some extent against PRC pressure on Taiwan. But as it seems to me, anyway, the real significance is just that the South Korean government would really be making much of any kind of statement at all. I think previously in past years, the tensions in the Taiwan Strait would be the sort of issue that I think most Korean policymakers would just as soon not really talk about or worry about. Like, it's not really our problem. We have
Mhm.
we have our own problems with North Korea to worry about. We're worried about our trade relationship with the PRC. There's really no benefit to us in trying to rock the boat on,
Yep.
uh, on this particular issue.
Mhm.
So I would say just the fact that the Korean government was willing to make any kind of statement about it,
Mhm.
at least hints at, again, sort of in a gentle, indirect way, but does provide some hint of increasing concern or attention about the issue, but still in rather measured terms, and not making any kind of strong provocative statement. But so I see that as the significance there. Hmm.
Mhm. I think your observations is really interesting, and yeah, I'm learning a lot here. So I'm gonna kind of move on to the regional allies. So how do regional partners or allies such as Japan, Australia, and the Philippines view a potential crisis in the Taiwan Strait? And what concrete steps are they taking in response? What does their approach mean for South Korea in terms of its security position and coordination with these partners?
Hmm. Sure. Well, I think there's been a pretty clear recent trend line
Mhm.
of other Asian states expressing increasing concern over PRC actions. Now, often maybe still in somewhat measured terms, or maybe indirectly,
Mhm.
uh, but there are also governments in the region that have been prepared to make much stronger direct statements, and it tends to be, understandably, it tends to be those countries that are kind of most on the receiving end of PRC pressure or aggressive actions. And in particular, I'm thinking of the Philippines and Japan over the course of the past year, with, for example, the President Marcos in the Philippines making what were some kind of almost surprisingly direct public statements to the effect that a crisis over Taiwan would certainly engage the Philippines. The Philippines just couldn't kind of like stand by,
Mhm.
um, and expressing concern for the large number of Filipino migrant workers that are
Yeah.
in Taiwan and the need to evacuate them, but sort of also the implications that a crisis over Taiwan would have for the Philippines' own security. And of course, that's alongside the backdrop of the continuing kind of like low-level clashes that are taking place between the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard and then the Philippine Coast Guard in the South China Sea. And of course, we've seen that some very strong statements over the course of the past week made by Japan's new Prime Minister Takaichi, where she made comments to the effect that an attack on Taiwan would be a direct threat to Japan's own security in really fundamental ways. And of course, the diplomatic firestorm that has erupted over that, with really provocative statement being made by PRC consul in Japan, like that her head should be cut off and things like this. But anyway, there has been, I think, a pretty clear trend line of states in the region being more willing, albeit sometimes still very cautiously, to make statements of concern about PRC actions. And I think, I mean, it might be too early to tell how it all shapes up, but I think it kind of raises an interesting question as to whether or not we might be looking at some longer term shifts in security alliances in Asia. Up to this date, up to this point. That there are multiple security alliances in Asia, but they tend to be what might be termed like hub and spoke relationships with the United States, or and not multilateral. The United States has a security treaty with the Philippines. It has a treaty with Japan. It has a treaty with the ROK. But again, those are all just direct security alliances that those states have with the United States, and not really with each other in any way. But I think and again, it's still early, but I think we're seeing some halting things, such as discussions of a limited deployments of Japanese military personnel to the Philippines, which is, I mean, if you think back 10 years, that would have just seemed crazy or impossible, right? And some, discussions of some possible quiet behind the scenes security coordination, maybe, multilateral exercises or so forth to be conducted between, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan. And so I think there's some interesting hints at what might be a slowly emerging sort of new security framework with some of these states in the region, which were traditional, just like one-on-one allies with the U.S., but maybe having at least a limited willingness to engage in more direct cooperation with each other. And from there, if that does indeed continue to develop, it raises some interesting questions for the ROK as to whether or not to engage with that. As to whether or not it would be to the benefit of the ROK to engage more in Japan, to set aside a lot of those difficult, historical issues that have created so much friction, but to think about engaging more in security terms with Japan, with the Philippines, maybe with Taiwan, or if there's a decision made on the part of Korean policymakers, they're like, no, we still need to keep back from that, and maybe just maintain our relationship with the U.S. and try to keep a friendly diplomatic and trade relationship going with with Beijing. So I think it raises some really interesting questions for how South Korea will choose to adapt its policies in this environment.
I totally agree with you. I think that's really fascinating that you brought, the points that countries may have to multilaterally cooperate, and they might do the military exercises together. And I think we just have to keep monitoring. And as from Korean standpoint, I think we just have to be really carefully monitoring these developments going forward, I guess. So from your vantage point, what are the most realistic policy options for South Korea to prepare for Taiwan-related crisis while balancing relations with both Washington and Beijing? Because you kind of brought that up in the earlier question.
Sure. Well, of course, it'll be up to people in South Korea to make these decisions, not me. But it seems to me anyway that, I mean, to some extent, I think South Korean officials are already doing what they can or they should be doing. They are showing a bit more willingness in the diplomatic realm to make some statements of concern or indicating that they're paying a little bit more attention to broader security issues in the region. Of course, South Korea continues to have a major security problem with North Korea. That's still unresolved after all these decades, and that of course is going to have to be the continuing primary point of attention for the ROK. But it is interesting to see some signs of looking beyond that.
Mhm.
For example, there's been some discussion recently. We'll see whether or not it actually happens, but there's been some discussion of the ROK Navy possibly attempting to obtain submarines,
Mhm.
uh,
Mhm.
nuclear submarines, in a deal with the U.S.
Yeah.
And if so, that would seem to indicate sort of a tension further afield in
Mhm.
the Pacific, rather than just like keeping a focus on North Korea.
Mhm.
Um, but again, have to see how that plays out. But so I think we're seeing in the public realm some indications along those lines again of maybe looking beyond the Korean Peninsula. But I do think though that it would be the benefit of South Korea, or there's going to have to be some discussions that perhaps might be more in private about contingency planning uh, for a major security crisis in the Pacific. Again, particularly maybe a conflict of some sort, whether it's war, blockade, what have you, over Taiwan. And I think there'll need to be contingency planning both in the military realm, getting back to some of these questions we already had, like what level of support would the United States be demanding,
Yeah.
and how do we respond to that? Like what do we do, as
Mhm.
well as preparations for possible provocations uh,
Mhm.
from the DPRK, but economic contingency planning as well. As we've discussed, South Korea has an export oriented, maritime trade oriented economy. All right,
Right.
so any conflict over Taiwan would carry with it tremendous disruptions to maritime sea lanes, as well as, and even setting aside the issue of the conflict over Taiwan, just sort of steadily creeping
Mhm.
PRC sovereignty claims in the South China Sea, for example, or in the Yellow Sea, have the capacity to also impact maritime trade. So
Mhm.
I think there also needs to be some quiet contingency planning in private going on, and I'm sure there are parts of South Korea's government in which those discussions are taking place. I would assume so anyway. I'm not part of them, but I can only assume those conversations are taking place and need to. Mhm.
So the final question. So looking ahead, what scenarios do you see as most plausible for the Taiwan Strait over the next few years? And which early warning indicators should South Korean policymakers monitor most closely?
Oh, sure. that you asked me a very hard question there. Well, I mean, maybe in one respect easy, but in another respect very difficult. What we're likely to see the next few years, I would predict, well, what we've already been seeing for the last few years, but probably more of it.
Mm,
I'm expecting that the PRC's coercive efforts directed against Taiwan are only going to increase. Um,
mhm.
Once again, over the last few years, we've seen steadily increasing what's often termed gray zone
Yeah.
of military operations.
Mhm.
They're conducted by the PLA Air Force, the PLA Navy, but also increasingly by the Chinese Coast Guard.
Mhm.
And these are operations sort of like coming in closer and closer, encroaching on Taiwan's airspace, upon its sea space, and which are intended to undermine Taiwan's sovereignty, its ability to effectively administer its own territory, to sort of undercut its sovereignty as a state, as well as to um, create a sense of psychological pressure upon the citizens of Taiwan. They're intended to sort of generate a feeling of hopelessness, like, oh, China is so powerful, there's nothing we can do to resist. The best thing we can do is just to try to make some kind of a deal. It's intended to produce that sort of thinking or reaction on the part of Taiwan citizens. And once again, along with that, that's sort of the more visible public face of PRC pressure. There are other forms that are not seen in public quite as clearly. Once again, cyber intrusions, pervasive online propaganda and disinformation, these sorts of things. But I expect all that, which has been steadily ramping up over the last few years, where I think we're just going to see more and more of it, unfortunately. Now, in terms of something beyond that, or a crisis more serious than that, I do tend to lean towards the camp that thinks that perhaps something like a blockade in some form is probably more likely than an outright invasion or an outright shooting war. It's not outside the question. In fact, I think, looking over at the next few years, it may become increasingly likely that the PRC may ultimately escalate these gray zone operations towards something like either a declared blockade or some sort of undeclared semi-blockade. Putting out a demand that any merchant ships going into Taiwan first pull into a PRC port, or that they submit to customs inspections by the PRC Coast Guard, things like that, or declaring particular sea lanes off limits. I think it's not outside the question, and in fact becoming increasingly likely, as these gray zone operations escalate, that we may within a few years be looking at something like that. And I think that would sort of be the next logical step in PRC pressure against Taiwan. And I fear we may see something like that. And I think there's a very real possibility of that occurring.
That sounds a little scary to me, actually. I mean,
Well, it should be.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
very alarming prospect. And even something like that, even if the PRC leadership were to decide upon a coercive act, below the threshold of war, such as, again, blockade, soft blockade, something like that, that there are many, many ways in which a situation like that can escalate, and maybe in ways that the people who started it didn't expect or intend. There's a lot of ways in which a situation like that can go sideways, can go wrong. So it is a very alarming prospect to think about.
But I think it's really nice that you kind of lay down like the various indicators that we should be watching out for and we should be monitoring. So that was my last question. So John, thank you very much for your insights and for helping us think through how Taiwan's trade dynamics intersect with South Korea's strategic environment and alliance dynamics. This has been very valuable conversation, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Olivia. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye.